you have been, as I mentioned, intimately involved in the creation of someone who's going to be duking it out. It's a big week. Bob Iger's on the cover of Bloomberg Business Week this week, as many of you have seen. How do you look at it as an investor, this moment where we are? Because it feels big in the media landscape.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, it is a huge week for streaming, at least in the public eye. And for the participants, they actually shouldn't be learning about what they're reading. They should be well down the road with defining a strategy and executing. Two things I'd say. First, perspective is always helpful, which is hard to do in the middle of such an exciting week and such a hot topic. And everybody cares about media. I think if we were talking about companies that make these couches we're sitting on, we wouldn't be talking about it.
Right.
But media is fascinating. We consume it. It entertains us. It informs us. There's a social aspect. And so it has high impact, way above the dollars, which are substantial, but reach us all. The first observation, this is the perspective one, that I've been doing this for 30 years, but I've been studying it for 50 years. Every decade has something that in the moment you think is mind-blowing and actually determines the fortunes of companies and the experience of viewers. It's typically occasioned by technology change, regulation, and importantly, consumer behavior. And we're seeing two of those play out right now, which are really about consumer behavior. And I would argue, even though it's a fascination, technology, because yes, 5G is going to matter hugely, but even without that, we're headed down a path where linear programming is in the decline. That's a consumer behavior issue, and that we haven't seen that before. And then the enabling networks to get in high def whatever you want, when you want.
And so how significant, if you look across these inflection points, this one, especially from an investor's perspective, there are many investors in the room, how do you look at this moment? What is about to unfold will determine the fates of what we used to call franchise, legacy media companies, and new entrants. I don't think there will be enormous winners. Whenever you see that, there are losers. I heard that quote before, implying that it's hard to know. Actually, I think we know a lot about how this will unfold. It's not dispositive, but you have companies, you can think of it in two ways. Those that have legacy media businesses. Every strategy that I've seen is a consequence of where they're coming from. And those legacy businesses and strategies actually matter, and you'll see very different models. We'll get into this in a few minutes. Yeah. And then you see a different dynamic, which we haven't seen before, which is significant. There are some competitors that actually don't need to make money. And that's really significant. If you're in business, if you're an investor, and you're competing with someone that doesn't need to make a profit. And by the way, I'm thinking of YouTube, Google, Amazon. For Amazon, and these are, I'm not randomly picking the companies, these are all in the game. Just to make sure I understand what you're saying, that don't need to make money off of streaming. On streaming. And we're talking about streaming, which is all the consumer cares, which is going to, the landscape 10 years from now is going to look very different. But Amazon is a good example. For Amazon, whatever they do in video could be considered a marketing expense for Prime, a way to get more Prime customers, stickier, happier, satisfied. And if they spend $3-5 billion on it, it is worth it to them. In contrast to Netflix, no, Netflix ultimately has to be profitable. They need free cash flow. By the way, I think Netflix, we talk about the streaming wars, I think they've won. It's a little bit like Larry Bird in some three-point contest in the locker room before the game. He said, so which one of you guys is going to come in second? Wow.
So you think Netflix has that much of a lead at this point?
I do. Mostly because, for two reasons. One is they, 60 million subs in the U.S. They're going to be at 200 globally, which means they can pay more and are. 15 billion, it was probably on the slide a few minutes ago. And they have learned a lot. And execution matters in any business. This is no different. So they have a huge advantage. I cannot imagine them being one of the winners.
You can't imagine them not being one.
Not being. They will be there, but at some point they will be judged not on subscriber growth and engagement, which Reed talks a lot about engagement right now, and that makes sense. But ultimately, it's like falling to earth. It's gravity. You're judged by free cash flow and earnings ultimately, and that'll be an interesting pivot. Disney should be a winner. They have obviously enormous valuable brands. They have inspired leadership. They are leaning all in on direct to consumer. They've got three strategies: sports through ESPN, Hulu, which we were founding investors, and now Disney Plus. So the combination of those powerful brands, strong leadership, great DNA in media, I would put money on them too. By the way, the unknown will be execution.
Right.
It will matter. It's a different business, but they'll be a force. So
and they do need to make money, Disney.
And they do. They absolutely do. And all these strategies and the judgment they're on are a little different because in their case, yes, they need to make money. And they have something that Netflix doesn't have, which could be considered a disadvantage. I mentioned all the advantages, which is that they will be losing money in the existing model.
Right.
So they not only have to make money in the new model, there's focus on that, they've got to do better than Netflix because they're already
to overcome.
Yes, because it'll be the net that matters.
So I want to ask you, shifting gears a little bit to an area that Geeta didn't talk about, which is the live side of this. Sports obviously enter into it.
Yeah.
We were talking a little bit about backstage. My family, at least, hasn't gone full streaming because of sports in a lot of ways. You have invested pretty heavily in live experiences and specifically in sports. So what does that investment case look like in this broader context?
Yeah, so it's a great question because as I sit here, there are three wild cards in streaming, and one of them has to do with sports. The wild cards are sports rights, and specifically the NFL, which I don't hear much in the conversation. If you're trying to figure out where streaming is going, and we'll talk, we're engaged in lots of live events and investments, but into the rubric of television and whatever device, actually, and streaming, key point to watch out for is what happens to the NFL rights. The model that all of us have grown up with, at least over the last 20 years, has been extended, supported by sports.
Right.
And ESPN's top of the list. And major networks have heavily invested. And just to give you a sense, in television, 70% of the top 100 shows are NFL games.
Wow.
Think about that. And the first event that will come up, and it won't be dispositive, but it'll be significant, will be DirecTV. I believe the league has the right to opt out of that. At the end of this football season, so next year, early next year, maybe Direct keeps it. I'm not privy to what they'll do. But where it goes will be very interesting. If it stays with Direct or it moves to, especially if it moves not to one of the big networks who's already got a contract, but a tech company. And even more important will be 21, 22, when NBC, CBS, and ESPN contracts are up. And maybe by then ABC is back in the game, literally.
what happens to those? Now, historically, the NFL has been smartly experimenting with different platforms, non-traditional.
Yeah, they're doing the little Amazon, right?
Yes, Amazon, and before that, Twitter. And I'm not expecting them to wholesale move away from the big broadcasters. But between where we are now and some point down the road,
Yeah.
all of that will happen. So that's a tipping point and that's all about live.
Right.
All about live. By the way, the other two would be consumer behavior, which is hard to predict. And we'll probably get back to that. But to keep going with your live question.
Yeah.
So music's a good example. We invested in Warner Music years ago. It was a successful investment, but we could see in the catbird seat how much of the revenue of the music industry was leaving the labels. Thank you, Apple, by the way, which really forced that issue, but it was probably inevitable anyway. And it moved to touring. And so we did as investors. We said we have to focus not on the equivalent for music, which is still very important. Consumption is high, but the dollars are flowing in different streams. And we moved to live concerts. So we have the fastest growing live concert company in Europe, where we're doing a roll-up under the Superstruck name. We've invested in Europe and in the US with all the engineering, design, infrastructure that is behind the scenes for music festivals, a company called Tate, which has tapped right into the most important part of music consumption right now, which is touring. So those are examples. We're also doing it actually right here in New York and in Europe with Ambassador Theater Group, which is live theater.
Right.
The best IP, because it's not ours, we just produce it.
Yeah.
And provide all the technical and physical support you need. You need real theaters. And it's done incredibly well.
Well, and it's pretty easy to connect those investments in live theater and in music to your success with Iron Man, for instance, in terms of live experience, in terms of sort of almost the opposite, to some extent, of the streaming wars is people actually, God forbid, getting out and doing stuff instead of, Netflix and chill.
Yeah, no, it's a funny world we live in. It's one of extremes. I mean, we see that in politics,
yes.
Especially this season. It'll be even more so a year from now. But we say you're either on the couch or you're running you're competing in a triathlon.
Right.
How is that possible?
Both are good businesses.
Yes. Yeah, we try and satisfy both needs.
Right.
Iron Man was interesting. We were scouring the landscape for underappreciated sports. And we found Iron Man. First, we were shocked that someone actually owned it.
Yeah.
And we bought it and transformed the business. They owned very few, less than 10 races, and took that to 100 around the world as opposed to licensing it out, improved it, the competitors' experience, the operations. If you do something 100 times a year, you should be much better than the group that does it once.
Yeah. All right, so before we run out of time, and you alluded to this, so I want to jump on it, which is the next year is going to be especially interesting for people in your business, in the private equity business. It is squarely in the political rhetoric, thanks largely to Elizabeth Warren. What does private equity need to do? What's the case that private equity needs to make to at least fend off some of this rhetoric?
Well, we've always had a problem between the public understanding of private equity, and probably thrown off by its very name because we're far from private, what we're actually doing. So what Elizabeth Warren and others have been talking about is far from what we actually do, which is good investors, private equity investors, are keenly focused on helping companies grow
It's the only way to do well in what is really largely, especially in developed markets, a low-growth world. For Providence, we have added tens of thousands of jobs, not just from the beginning, but even in the last 3 years. Topgolf, which is both about what we're talking about, live entertainment. It also happens to be a sport. We've added, I think it's 11,000 jobs in roughly the last 3 years. That's a great story. It doesn't sound like the version that some political leaders attribute to us. It's actually just the opposite. We spend enormous amounts of money and time helping CEOs and management teams grow their business. It happens to be good for society. It's also good for our investors. And by the way, who are our investors? Who are the beneficiaries of our success? The largest group of beneficiaries in private equity would be public pension funds. Those are teachers and public employees. Now, for political reasons, and it's understandable, they cannot or are unwilling to get up and say, hey, this is the most important asset class to us. In fact, without this, we can't even meet our obligations. But that's okay. We have, and we need to do a much better job of this, we have armies of employees and leadership that are actually benefiting from good practices in our space, not just media and telecom and education, where Providence equity focuses. Did I say the wrong word?
Yeah. It's Elizabeth Warren calling.
Yeah. Well, I just like the chance to talk to her about this. So I'm glad she's calling.
Yeah.
I'm proud of what we do. When we started Hulu, people thought that was nuts. No one says that today.
Right.
And I could go on and on. We built T-Mobile in the U.S. It was called VoiceStream. I'm proud of that work.
Right. So 45 seconds left. What's your biggest challenge for 2020 for you as the CEO of Providence? 30th year, entering your 31st year.
Gosh, we have to always look around the bend, not focus on where we are now, but where we're going, and try. And our investments are to basically answer the question of where will there be unmet demand for service and products, and be there and help those companies in our portfolio, there are roughly 40, help them grow. That's what we do every day.